Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So, Tim, I've been on the Lord's pilgrimage for about a week and a half, and honestly, I'm a bit out of touch with politics and policy, but I think that's a good thing. But you have been working hard on the ball. So what's been the intrigue at the Capitol?
Well, the big intrigue upcoming this week is the state budget. Every year, Governor Newsom or any governor releases their initial budget plan in January. Then after the state gets the tax revenue in April and we update the economic forecast and the revenue figures, the governor releases what we call the May revision. And that really kicks off the budget debate. So later this week, Governor Newsom will release his revised budget plan. And the more things change, the more things stay the same. So what are the hot issues that are being kicked around? High-speed rail, that I don't know why, this hasn't been given an honorable death yet, but
I saw that Cal Matters story you sent me this morning, and oh my gosh, how complicated that sounds.
So the administration wants to spend the remaining amounts of the Prop 1A bonds. I think it's about $4.5 billion. They want that appropriated to finish the train to nowhere section of it being built in the Central Valley. And Democrats in the legislature, though they support high-speed rail, they have been fighting the administration's plans for over a year. And it doesn't seem like they're anywhere closer to coming up with a resolution. So obviously, if you represent, LA, you want to see bright, shiny trains in your area that your constituents could ride. You want to see cranes in your area and jobs being created. You don't want to see something in Merced. I don't know how they're going to solve this anytime soon. They say the Biden administration might kick in $3 or $4 billion. That's nothing of what's going to be needed to finish this project. And then, of course, we have the gas tax, and that's another big fight that's been going on for a while. And I've been writing about that. Everybody seemingly has their own plan to cut the gas tax, including Democrats in the legislature have actually competing plans. There's a group of moderate Democrats have one plan. Legislative Democratic leadership has another plan. Newsom has his own plan. And basically they revolve around some kind of rebate being issued. And then Republicans in the legislature just want to suspend the gas tax for 6 months. Some have proposed it for a year. So everybody has their own plans, but there's no agreement amongst one another. And we continue to pay $5.65, $5.75 or more per gallon for gas with no relief in sight.
Yeah, Tim, what's interesting about that is that it sounds like some Democrats have signed on to the Republican idea of suspending the gas tax. That's interesting. That's intriguing. What brought that about?
Well, I think that's just politics. They're running for re-election. Some of them represent areas like the Central Valley or Orange County that are more conservative. And they get it. They don't want to face voters not having done their job, which is to give relief from high gas prices. And it's something legislators can do. Literally, they could go in today and do it. So I think it's politics driving the day. And some of those folks, even in California, could be in for a tough re-election fight, even, in this, 2022, that will be a more favorable year for Republicans. So they don't want just a proposal. They want to be handing out checks to constituents. So then the other thing, of course, that is kind of overshadowing all of this is California, even though, we continue to do very well as far as the revenue projections, though the recent slide in the stock market might affect capital gains tax revenue that we're overly reliant on in California. California actually has a budget problem on the horizon, and it has to do with the gain limit, which our listeners may have been following, which was passed back in the heyday of Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann. And it basically requires, it's a complicated formula, but over a certain amount of revenue, you have to give back money to taxpayers in the form of tax rebates, and legislators can determine what form that takes. And so that is very much complicating their lawmakers' efforts to draft the budget. And so, of course, lawmakers don't want to have to give, it could be more than $10 billion in tax relief. So there are efforts afoot to try to get around it. There's some areas of spending that don't count toward the gain limit. And I predict they're going to be coming to voters sometime, maybe this year, maybe in 2024, to try to either repeal or weaken the gain limit so they can do what they want to do, spend money without having to give it back to taxpayers.
Well, there's no end to the machinations happening in Sacramento. So thanks for that, Tim. Wanted to mention one commercial. Everyone is invited to our Orange County Gala. The keynote speaker is Kellyanne Conway, and it's on June 11th. That's a Saturday at the beautiful Balboa Club in Newport Beach. And Kellyanne is going to be discussing her new book, a memoir. Many of our listeners might remember that she was a prominent pollster before becoming President Trump's advisor. And I'm very interested to get her thoughts on the midterm elections and the direction of both parties.
Yeah, and as always, PRI's galas, if I do say so myself, they're always very, our Laura Dannerbeck, our events director, does a fantastic job putting on really great, memorable evenings. So run, don't walk to buy your tickets today, because it'll be a terrific evening.
So our guest this week is our own Steve Greenhut, and we actually gave Steve a new job for PRI. He's going to be the director of PRI's Free Cities Project. And we started this initiative really because all around California and the West and really the nation, cities have begun to decay. And at PRI, we wanted to do something about that. And we're going to be looking at all aspects of city life, including housing, homelessness, crime, poor inner city schools. We're going to be on it, and you'll hear from Steve and our other writers for the next several years, trying to really look into the problems of the cities and trying to revitalize our cities again.
Yeah, when you see the lineup of writers, these are really not only our great PRI scholars, but really big names in the free market world in California who will be writing and contributing regularly to the Free Cities Project. And you'll see, blogs. We're going to have little magazine booklets that we're putting out. There's going to be, webinars and videos. It's bringing free market ideas where they really could be put to best use. And that's turning around our cities that are struggling and hopefully making them a more livable place again. So I think you'll find what Steve has to say interesting, and I think you'll find the content you'll see in the coming weeks and months very interesting as well.
Thanks so much. And here's Steve Greenhut. Steve, welcome back to PRI's Next Round podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So we're really happy to have you on to talk about PRI's new Free Cities Project, which builds upon our work on issues like poverty, crime, homelessness that are all negatively impacting urban centers in California and out here in the West. So we tapped you to run it because we know as a longtime libertarian, your heart is in all things local. So describe PRI's and your vision of the Free Cities Project.
Yeah, I think it's really important to focus on urban issues. Cities are extremely important. Even people who don't like to go to cities. There's just a vibrancy and an importance in having our biggest urban areas functioning properly. So many people live in them for starters, and they offer so much cultural value and economic value to our societies. And it looks to me we see a lot of horrible urban policies that are turning beautiful, wonderful cities into not quite dystopias as some critics would make them seem, but are making them less livable. And we see recently, for instance, LA and San Francisco, they've had a notable exodus of people out of the city since COVID. And I think San Francisco lost like 5% of its population, which is stunning. And out here in the Sacramento area, there are all sorts of people moving from San Francisco and the Bay Area, and LA is seeing a similar exodus, and that's just people vote with their feet. And it's important to look at policies that might work in cities. So one of the visions that this Free Cities Project is is to just simply dump on cities and to say how horrible it is and encourage people to leave. That's not what this is about. This is about coming up with policies that will make cities better places. So, my daughter, my oldest daughter lives in San Francisco, and she's just feeling, and she loves San Francisco, and her neighborhood is just feeling less safe. And all sorts of examples of things that have happened. And we want people to feel safe in their neighborhoods and not have to flee cities. And so we want to be positive. We'll do plenty of negative things about the bad policy, but the goal here is to focus on good ideas. And it's not overtly political in that we're not focusing on, we need to just change all these politicians and then we'll get good policies. The idea is to come up with ideas and investigative reporting and thoughtful feature writing that encourages whomever happens to be in charge to embrace policies that are helpful and encourage healthy cities where people want to live in and rather than flee.
So lots of great content is planned for the launch of the Free Cities Project, including a great new website and video interviews. So share with our listeners some of the pieces they'll be able to check out initially, and also some of the writers who will be sharing their thoughts for the Free Cities Project in the coming weeks.
Yeah, the pieces they're flowing in. We have a video interview that I just did last week with Jim Palmer, the president of the Orange County Rescue Mission, and he's one of the most thoughtful people on the issue of homelessness. I mean, he knows what works. He's been doing it for decades there in Orange County, creating real housing for people and helping them improve their lives. And I think a lot of the homeless issue, as an example, is just it's a mishmash of people yelling at each other about the mess that we have in our cities. And Jim's got good ideas. I mean, just one point that he made is that 87% of the people that they deal with self-identify as having drug addiction or mental health issues. So that certainly changes the discussion a bit. And that's what we want to do with Free Cities Project, is change the discussions. I mean, it's not, if that's the case, then we're dealing with a sea of social service issues and not simply a housing issue. So those are some of the things. So Jim's going to be the first featured video. I've got a ton of pieces coming in, but one of the ones, a question and answer I do with Tom Tate, the former mayor of Anaheim. And some of his ideas have really inspired my thinking on Free Cities Project. They, back in the mid-2000s, Tom and some other people on the council instituted a freedom-friendly Anaheim, and they implemented policies that reduced zoning requirements and made it easier for businesses to permit themselves, and outlawing the use of eminent domain for redevelopment projects, and a lot of the kind of good market-oriented small L libertarian policies that really helped Anaheim boom, and they are in a bit of a boom right now. And sadly, as a side note, the city, through their old redevelopment policies, leveled their beautiful historic downtown. That's what you don't want to do. So we've got PRI's own Lance Izumi has a great piece on how school choice can help revive older urban areas. I've experienced that myself. I know when I moved to California in the 90s, we found a really nice urban neighborhood that we wanted to move into. And I called the principal of the school, and he said to me, we just can't serve your kids here. So the fact that I would have had to pay for private schools for 3 kids totally changed the dynamic, and we moved to a suburban neighborhood instead. So I think that reviving school choice, giving parents a choice of where they can send their kids, will certainly encourage them to move into cities. We've got Kerry Jackson, also of PRI. He's reviewing Michael Schellenberger's book, San Francisco. And Schellenberger's running for governor, actually, so that might make the review even more timely. PRI's Steve Smith has a piece about Prop 57, which increased the use of parole and what that's meant for crime. Got Wendell Cox, the great housing scholar, who's looking at some of the housing policies and what we can do to improve the housing situation. I've got a piece on how unions are constantly restricting urban reform. Wayne Weingarten the housing first policy and homelessness. And Chris Reed of the Union Tribune's got a piece that just came in on the cult of bicycles and how that's distorting urban transportation policy. So a whole lot of variety and some very serious pieces, more lighthearted pieces, videos. We'll have a whole mix of feature and news and opinion writing.
So, Steve, one of the reasons why we launched the Free Cities Project is because, frankly, there aren't a lot of think tanks following city issues and urban policy. You write, and I agree that conservatives have a lot of good ideas, but they fail to sell their ideas to the cities. So in your view, how will the Free Cities Project fill this important void of market-based reforms to solve the real problems facing our cities and improving the quality of life for those of us who actually live there?
Yeah, I'd like to, for starters, encourage conservatives to get excited about cities. And conservatism increasingly is connected to suburban and rural areas. But cities are great places. Ironically, the progressives who do seem to love cities, their ideas they're making a mess of the cities that they're in charge of. And a lot of the conservative ideas on all the major urban issues, transportation, housing, will actually work. But it helps if you're really credible in wanting the cities to be great places. So I just get a sense. There's this sense that a lot of times conservatives are, cities, they're awful. Did you see that new poop app in San Francisco that helps you navigate around the piles of human excrement left by homeless people? It's awful. You don't want to go there. And that's not the spirit that I want to encourage. I think we need to like San Francisco is a magnificent city. Even some of the cities in the Central Valley that are some of the lesser cities in California, like Fresno and Bakersfield, are great and fascinating places, and we need to want those cities to thrive. So. But there are a lot of good conservative ideas. There's some bad conservative ideas out there too. I want to wrestle through some of the tougher ones, things like criminal justice reform. There are good criminal justice reforms. I've covered policing and the criminal justice system for a long time at the newspaper, and there are a lot of problems. Like any government agency, there's room for reform, and I think one of the reasons that we've seen so much frustration, with some of the Black Lives Matter protests and so forth, is because a lot of these issues have not been dealt with. I'd like to see a return to some of the more community-oriented policing policies, but there are policies that are ridiculous, right? When you have district attorneys who aren't prosecuting crimes, or who are allowing, under Prop 47, people to just steal stuff and get away with it. That creates a sense of disorder in the cities, and we see stores closing in some of the cities because they don't want to have to deal with the shoplifting epidemic and the smash and grab robbery. So I'm trying to find a balance. That doesn't mean it's just middle of the road. I want to look at good ideas from anywhere, things that actually work and things that aren't just meant for political campaigns.
So let's talk about some of the issues that are hindering urban life on the West Coast and get a preview of some of the work of the great minds behind the Free Cities Project. So crime, of course, is on everyone's mind in the aftermath of the tragic Sacramento shootings and the continued rise in retail theft and violent incidents in our big cities. So why do progressive mayors who lead our big cities, as you write, talk about the importance of good quality urban life, yet at the same time seem to embrace policies that sow disorder and threaten public safety?
Yeah, I think politicians end up, they come to their positions with a set of policies that they almost have to embrace based on the coalitions that have helped elect them. And you end up with mayors they're connected to some of the activist groups that want criminal justice reform and want these things. And then it's very hard for them to push back when there's a crime problem. Now we see someone like London Breed in San Francisco and has been pushing back taking a firmer line on some of the policing issues. People, on both sides of the political spectrum, politicians end up accepting a bundle of issues, and it makes it, some of them, they just can't stand up to their own coalitions. And I think it's really hard to be a politician, especially in a big city with really liberal politics, and try to take a middle of the road stance, just like it's hard for some conservatives in very conservative areas to try to take a middle of the road stance. So we see the two tribes fighting it out politically, and there's a lot of incentive to come across as the most zealous on your side. So I think in recent years, one of the things that I found dismaying in our politics is a move away from, policy-oriented discussions and a move towards, our side against their side. Let's own the other side. And being a policy geek, and we're a policy think tank. We want to see people discuss policies. What works? What doesn't work? There are ideas that I've had that I look back and it looks like they didn't work. So we've got to change our mind, and we've got to try something different if what we supported in the past didn't work. So I think that's a lot of what I want to do here on the website is look at what works, what makes cities nicer places, more beautiful places, what makes them nicer places to live, and also to create some energy, behind the idea of cities as great places, and kind of a bottom-up approach. I've always been a big fan of Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And her ideas were ones where the good ideas flowed from the bottom up. She had talked in that book about one of the big Robert Moses style urban planning projects in New York. I don't know, back in the 50s, I think, where there was a slum neighborhood, and the city built these big, at the time, they were big, fancy new housing projects. And the people who lived there, they just couldn't stand it because they ended up demolishing all the interconnected businesses and things that were part of their lives. So there's this quote that I grabbed from her book. It says, "There's a quality even meaner than outright ugliness or disorder, and this meaner quality is the dishonest mask of pretended order achieved by ignoring or suppressing the real order that is struggling to exist and to be served." So the idea is our libertarian and market ideas are we believe that the real order comes from the independent decisions made by individuals living in cities, not by people in planning offices who are imposing their visions on the people in those cities. And there's a role for planners and planning, of course, but we're trying to restore some faith in the marketplace and the small business and the individual who's building their community, and not just focused on government. And that's, I think, what a lot of the progressive cities have done so poorly, is they focus more on city hall and on big spending projects and on big planning projects, rather than unleashing the market forces and the energies and entrepreneurship of the people who live in cities.
So, Steve, that leads me to our next question here. So the shaping of America's big cities over the past century has been pretty much centered around heavy-handed government decisions by city planners. In recent years, many of the problems in our urban communities seem to center around government planners, government social engineers making decisions for urban life around their narrow vision, which often conflicts with the desires of the community or entrepreneurs. How would a free market vision for restoring urban life, as we'll be discussing on the Free Cities Project, be a lot more effective in empowering communities and encouraging investment over this big government status quo?
I go back to what I had mentioned with Tom Tate and Anaheim. And what they did there was there was an area of basically industrial areas near the stadium, and it seemed like a natural place for a downtown for not just the city but for all of Orange County. It was near where a lot of the main freeways connected, and it was just this kind of underutilized area. So one of the things they did was they upzone, where essentially you could keep your industrial business. They're not going to take it from you, but you could build other things too. You can build apartments and offices and whatever the market would bear. and they encourage people to come up with their own plans. And in that case, I mean, that big time development there. So they're big developers mostly, and not so much just mom and pop operations. But bring your plans to us, and you know what? And we'll approve it, provided it meets a number of normal standards. And that's the approach they took in that area. The Platinum Triangle is this vibrant area. It is kind of a downtown now, with offices and retail and all sorts of things. What was there before was mostly, it's just an underutilized industrial area, and which is a big difference from cities that often what they'll do is they'll decide that we want this to be a downtown area, and then they recruit developers and they shower public subsidies on those people, and that's not the idea that really works, and you end up with extremely boring development often in that case, because it's all being hatched in City Hall. I mean, Tim and I live in the Sacramento area, and downtown Sacramento is really booming these days. But the one street that remains awful through it all, year in and year out, is K Street, right? And that's the street that the city can't let go of. The redevelopment agency, pumped at one point like $6 million into two restaurants, a nightclub, and they won't let it go. And I think if they just loosen up and let businesses come up with their own ideas and view planning not as a way to get an achieved result, but as a way of just ensuring that certain setbacks and certain basic general standards are met. And then just let people are vibrant. People have ideas. People who invest their money in places, they're going to create the most vibrancy. And I like cities where there's all sorts of things going on. And if you overly plan, overly zone, you end up with some pretty boring development. And a lot of the I want to touch just briefly on SB 9 and SB 10, which they're good laws, in my view, that the state, Governor Newsom recently signed into laws. That the 9 allows single-family home owners to build duplexes on their property, and 10 allows the development of like mid-rise condos and things along transit corridors. And I think that's kind of that's a good idea. It allows people to do more things with their own land. And a lot of conservatives have opposed those. They somehow think that the suburban single-family development, which I have nothing against, single-family homes are great, but they think that's just a product of the market, and it's not. It's a product of a previous generation of government planners, and there's no reason that we can't use property rights and encourage private actors to build more and varied things. I mean, one city where I have a house, there's stores within the nicest neighborhoods. You have little stores and mixed use. I find that to be far more interesting than I'm thinking of one highly planned city where there are all the single family homes, and then all the churches are in one place, and then all the businesses are in one place. Why don't we let markets work?
So let's follow up on this point. Property rights and eminent domain has certainly been a major part of your writings the past 2 decades. And of course, your very important book on this, Abuse of Power. The debate over eminent domain abuse has kind of waned somewhat in recent years, largely following the dissolution of redevelopment agencies in California. So where do things stand today on this? And does eminent domain continue to be kind of an albatross for turning around blighted downtown areas into thriving communities? And if so, what can be done about it?
Yeah, well, in 2005, there was the Kelo decision, the U.S. Supreme Court Kelo decision, which had allowed cities to take private property by eminent domain and give it to other private owners. So in our Constitution, eminent domain is allowed for public uses, and advocates for expanded use of eminent domain argued that a public benefit would be sufficient. The problem with that little subtle change in language is a major big box store provides a lot of tax revenue, and that's a public benefit, arguably. And my property is no longer secure if a city can take it and give it to some organization that pays a higher level of taxes than I do. And then most of the states following Kelo, there was a lot of outrage. And Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's dissent was, I recommend reading it. She essentially said that, the beneficiaries are going to be the most powerful political players. And she's right. And that's what we saw in California's redevelopment agencies. Now, most cities changed their laws and restricted the use of eminent domain for such purposes. California did not do that. Now, it hasn't been used as often as before because Governor Jerry Brown eliminated the agencies when the state was at 2012, I believe, when the state was facing a budget crisis. Hard to imagine as it is now, but we had an enormous deficit. And those agencies, which officially are state agencies, even though they're run at the local level, ended up taking, I think, like 13% of the tax revenue because the state had to backfill the money that was taken from schools and some other firefighting and some other public services. Essentially, redevelopment agencies were started in the late 40s as a way to clean up blighted areas, and they allowed those agencies to target an area and grab all the tax increment, which is the increase in tax revenues after the redevelopment project is through. And then cities quickly learned that it's just a great tax grab. So they started subsidizing big box stores and auto malls and movie theaters. And they used eminent domain on behalf of developers. And it was just a giant tax grab. There were a couple of cities in Orange County, Westminster and Stanton, that declared their entire cities to be blighted. It was just a way, it's just a way to play this tax game. And anyway, we're fortunate those agencies no longer exist. There have been attempts to bring it back. Some of the financing mechanisms have come back through something called infrastructure finance districts, but they're not nearly as far-reaching as the old redevelopment. And right now we're pretty good, but how things go at the Capitol, bad stuff can always come back. But the threat of eminent domain, and that's the key thing, really constricted private development because who's going to invest in a property? Who's going to, if it's in a redevelopment area and that the city can take the property at any time and do something else with it. So it actually, redevelopment agencies actually slowed actual redevelopment. And, the threat of property loss it was enough to put the kibosh on a lot of private bottom-up type redevelopment efforts.
So a lot of our cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, many West Coast cities, get a lot of media attention for our out-of-control homeless problem. Typically, leaders champion one expensive big government program after another, spending billions each year with not much to show for it. There was a recent audit in Los Angeles on Measure HHH, and they spent up to $800,000 per unit. Unbelievable. So what's it going to take for urban policy makers to realize that government initiatives and government programs aren't the key to alleviating homelessness in their communities? And what can we look forward to in the Free Cities Project in the area of homelessness?
Yeah, it's a really crazy thing. I mean, even to this day in Los Angeles, you can still buy an actual home for $700,000, right? And there's some critics call it the homeless industrial complex, which I think is an apt description. It's like anything that government does, it throws money at problems, and then you've got these project labor agreements that make sure the unions get their cut of it, and a lot of the developers certainly are, want to be involved in this. So it's maybe not driven by what's helping the homeless so much as what benefits some of the groups that are providing the housing, and of course the government planners are involved, and any and there's CEQA and all the regulations, and it's costly to build these projects that in existing urban areas, and then they have to conform to all sorts of understandably so, but the state has all sorts of ADA requirements, sprinkler requirements, and you're all said and done, we're not actually helping any homeless people, or not many of them, and the push needs to be for smaller scale projects that are focused on I've seen ideas like building these little tiny house communities and And when I was at the rescue mission in Orange County, they took over a nonprofit, and they took over an old barracks on a military base and have turned it into nice housing. But as I mentioned before, the overwhelming number of homeless people, it's not purely a housing problem. It's a mental health issue problem and a drug addiction problem. And our government makes it extremely difficult to treat those problems. Especially there's a focus now on what they call housing first, which the idea is you get people housing. They need housing, get them housing. We can't put any restrictions on their behavior. And I understand that to a degree, and that everyone should be housed even if they have problems. But what you end up with is people dying alone in their apartments because no one, since they're not being entered into any sort of addiction treatment programs. And then we can't possibly at these prices build enough housing to deal with the number of homeless people. And then once these homeless encampments take over, like in a public park, and it's a shame that public parks, which ought to be parks for people to take a walk or take their kids, are turning into tent cities. And once you have a large tent city, it's extremely difficult to get rid of it, because there was the Boise decision, federal court decision, that cities cannot remove homeless unless they have housing to give to them. So we end up with this sprawling problem, and we need to look at smaller solutions, nonprofit solutions, solutions that treat people's addictions, and the government also restricts religious approaches. And of course, a good way to get people to change their behavior is through religious organizations are able to provide help that way. So we need to think smaller in a sense, and not just think big through planning departments and throwing more money at it, because we'll never have enough money.
So staying on that theme, another major failing of urban policymakers today is housing. And we've seen policymakers in big cities unveil all of these big initiatives to increase so-called affordable housing. Yet the construction of new supply remains too low and housing costs continue to soar. So what will the Free Cities Project have to say about housing reforms to increase home building and housing affordability in our biggest cities, which is really probably one of the biggest roadblocks keeping people from returning to urban life, if you think about it?
Yeah, and in many ways, there have been some articles about how our big cities are becoming childless cities, which doesn't seem natural to have cities that don't have, people from the youngest to the oldest, right? And that's because housing prices are so high in the biggest cities. They're high everywhere in California, but they're so high in the biggest cities. And it's a supply and demand issue. The California Legislative Analyst's Office has shown for years that the state is underbuilding at least 100,000 units a year for the state. Builders are not, the state isn't permitting enough housing. So when there's not enough there's not enough supply, the prices get driven up to the stratosphere, and then young families especially, can't afford to live in these cities. So we need to increase housing supply, and supply issues tend to be regional. So when you drive to San Francisco, you're near Oakland, and beautiful open hillsides as far as the eye can see in an area that's right near one of the biggest urban areas in the country, so that it's nice to look at. But all those growth restrictions have restricted the supply throughout the Bay Area. And I remember once when Jerry Brown, back when he was Attorney General, pointed to Marin County as the county just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, one of the wealthiest counties in the country, as an example of the right way to handle housing development in terms of climate change. Well, that county only has about 300,000 people, and the prices there have always been, astronomical. Only wealthy people can live there because of all these growth controls, and that forces people farther out into the hinterlands. I mean, the Stockton area and the San Joaquin Valley is now considered part of the Greater Bay Area because of the number of commuters that go over the Altamont Pass. Traffic nightmare. So we need to city governments need to allow the construction of market housing. SB 9 and SB 10 will help at the margins, but they need to have a totally different approach. And you can't, this idea that you build brand new housing, affordable housing for people ignores what Howard Cusack at Harvard refers to as the housing ladder. I've never owned a brand new house. I mean, people tend to buy older houses and then they move their way up and that frees up another house. So this idea that that the government should just build brand new housing units for people who can't afford them and then rent restrict them, that's not what most people want anyway. Most people want to own a house of their own, and it's a supply and demand issue, and it's very hard to build. And all these rent control and tenant laws in some of the cities only make it worse. I think it was the Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck who said that rent control is the best way to destroy a city short of bombing. So all these things add up to end up driving up the cost of market housing.
Education is also going to be an important focus on the Free Cities project. So public schools in our major urban centers are typically among the state's lowest performing schools. Steve, talk about how market-based reforms like school choice and access to homeschooling and charter schools can make a big difference both in helping urban families escape poor performing schools and improve the overall quality of education in our big cities.
Yeah, one of the big drivers of families moving to suburban areas is the school districts, and if a person could move into a city, even a rough older city, let's say like Fresno or Stockton, and know that they had a plenty of charter schools to choose from to send their kids, and they weren't dependent on a ill-performing local school, they'd be much more willing to move there. And also that creates, competition, of course, creates pressure on the existing school systems. They either get better or they lose their average daily attendance. And and homeschooling is a good idea, because that's one alternative for quite a few people. So any sort of alternatives and choice will actually help revive inner city neighborhoods. And it's only fair, right, to the people who are living there that their kids have a shot at a good education. I mean, the California Constitution guarantees the right to a quality education, and we look at how some of these school districts are performing, and it's abysmal. And our colleague Lance Azumi's book, I remember from years ago, Not As Good As You Think. I always loved that title. A lot of the good suburban schools really aren't as good as we think. So this is a good idea for everyone. But sending your kid to a decent suburban school, you can get by. But some of these schools in bigger cities are just not performing, and that's a key to reviving cities.
So finally, you write that the major urban issues that we've discussed today, crime, housing, homelessness, devastated downtown areas, and more, are typically addressed in a piecemeal fashion by leaders who really fail to understand what make good cities thrive. So how do you think the Free Cities project can play a role in changing this status quo thinking that permeates urban policy on the West Coast, and really inspire the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that's needed to, as you say, incubate good ideas that will improve our cities?
Yeah, I think it's pretty typical. People are energized by the crime problem or the homelessness problem, or, oh my gosh, look at housing prices and look at this. And it's harder to put it in the context of, well, these are all fundamentally urban issues, and we need maybe a broader urban focus with the goal being the revival of our cities. Now, I always get leery, and I'm sure we all do, when people talk about big projects, the Great Society type projects that everyone likes to talk about. So I'm not calling for an urban policy or anything, just an effort by local leaders and readers to understand that a lot of these problems are interconnected, and that the end goal should be to energize entrepreneurship and empower people to live their lives, and that's how you get improvement in our society. And that unfortunately in cities are the places, the bigger cities on the West Coast in particular, are the cities where the governments don't let people make their own choices, because you need a permit for everything. There's an agency that deals with everything. It's so hard to start a business. It's hard to build a house. It's hard to take your kids out of the bad school and find a good charter school. City governments make everything so hard, and transportation too. I mean, we have these road diets now, so that we're actually using transportation funds that voters supported, that were designed to improve transportation, to remove road lanes and replace them with bicycle lanes. I'm all for bicycles, but for heaven's sake, that just adds to congestion. And if the government would just, I think there's too much social engineering going on. My goal here, part of the goal is to focus on each of these problems, look at solutions, consider ideas that, maybe no one's considered before. I'm open to all sorts of ideas, even if they emanate from the left or the right, wherever they come from, good ideas. And then finally to encourage people to love cities and to care about cities and to want to make them great places again. And I think once that's a more widespread sentiment, I think maybe we'll start seeing some of the creativity we see in so many other parts of our society and apply those to urban issues.
Thanks, Steve. So we'll be launching our Free Cities project in May. So hope our listeners look for it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.